Unit 3. In Unit 3, I'll be talking about corporate governance and the role of the law. And you can see from the first picture of President Bush that we're going to be talking quite a bit about politicians. So we discussed in Unit 1 about dispersed versus concentrated perspectives of ownership in corporates. So we're going to be going back to that and delving into that debate and why some economies end up more characterized by dispersed ownership. Some economies in some countries end up with more concentrated ownership, and there's different sorts of explanations for that. We're going to be looking at the rise of equity culture in the EU, and then we're going to go back in history again and look at the historical perspectives around perhaps why certain countries developed dispersed versus concentrated ownership. And then just before we end, we'll fly to Hong Kong and look at the financial crisis in Hong Kong and some of the factors about the system in Hong Kong that allowed Hong Kong to escape the worst of the global financial crisis. And then finally, we'll look at the implications for transition and developing economies, including Africa, which is something that I'm passionate about. This is a really exciting module, and I think that Unit 1 and Unit 2 were more sort of academic. I think this really gets into the meat of corporate governance and the big question. So I said this unit is really sort of our first sort of taste at sort of some of the more practical concerns. So let's move. Steve Jobs, one of my favorite sort of people in the world, said that getting fired from Apple was the best thing that ever happened to him. He said, and I quote, "The heaviness of being successful was replaced by the lightness of being a beginner again. It freed me to enter one of the most creative periods of my life." I think the foundational thought with Unit 3 is the fact that the principal reason that investors provide external financing to firms is that they receive control rights in exchange. And that control can be demonstrated on so many board struggles, so many corporate struggles. But I think, the most prominent and important example in recent corporate history of the control that investors that provided external financing firms have is the sacking of Steve Jobs from the company that he founded. Now, I'd like us to remember this as we go into discussions around why certain countries have dispersed and why some countries have concentrated shareholder structures. So this is just a reminder that countries that protect shareholders, particularly minority shareholders, have more valuable stock markets. They have larger numbers of listed securities per capita. They have a higher rate of IPO, initial public offering activity, than the unprotective countries. Countries that protect creditors have better credit markets. So creditors are like the banks or people that give debts, people that give credit, also have larger credit markets. So I'll repeat that because this unit centers around this and all the lessons that we're going to learn sort of are related to this. Countries that protect shareholders have more valuable stock markets, larger numbers of listed securities per capita, and a higher rate of initial public offering activity than do the unprotected countries. Countries that protect creditors better have larger credit markets. And the people that said this are, again, really famous writers that we're going to see throughout the rest of this module. Porta is the first L. I've forgotten the name of the second L, but we'll come across it. Shleifer, I think his name is the pronunciation of the S, and Vishny is the third one. But the only one that I'm really sure of the pronunciation is, I think I got Porta right, but together they're called LLSV, and they did a lot of research on shareholder protection and comparison between the dispersed shareholder model and the concentrated shareholder model. So this is a great debate. The dispersed ownership system, which tends to be associated with the UK and the US, versus the concentrated ownership system, which is more common in continental Europe. Dispersed, like ants. A dispersed ownership system is characterized by widely dispersed shareholders. Under these kind of systems, security markets, and in particular stock markets, tend to be really active. So you see a lot of trades, like America, right? And shareholders are afforded a high level of protection. Consequently, though, listed companies in those type of countries must comply with rigorous disclosure standards, and the markets are very, very transparent. Concentrated is more like one big lion shareholder and then lots of small ones. So in concentrated shareholder countries or economies, ownership is characterized by large controlling block shareholders, the lions. Securities and stock markets tend to be weaker and less active than those in dispersed systems. There are high private benefits of control. So you collect rent, basically, from controlling a large stake in the company. And there are low standards of disclosure, market transparency. Banks, as shareholders and creditors, play a principal role in monitoring. And I think anybody from Nigeria watching this already knows which category we fall into. So why are some countries characterized by dispersed ownership while others characterized by concentrated ownership? There's two main explanations, and I've put two pictures of Obama here because he's both a lawyer and a politician. And the two competing explanations are, number one, the political explanation, and that sort of collides or conflicts with the legal explanation. So there's two different ways of explaining, or two different sets of academics that give different explanations for why some countries end up with this dispersed, like America, like the UK, shareholder structure, and some end up with a more concentrated. So the legal explanation. By Porta, Lopez, I still can't pronounce his name, Shleifer and Vishny, LLSV for short. So the legal explanation by LLSV talks about the fact that common law countries such as the UK or the US generally provide the strongest levels of investor protection. And French kind of civil law countries have the weakest legal protection of external investors. So they attribute it to the fact that in common law actually allows for more investor protection. So when you have common law, that means that the judges have flexibility to interpret different situations. So you can, as an investor, especially a minority investor, take a company to court and claim that the company has done something that isn't in the law. But the judge under the common law system has the ability to interpret that law, make a different, more flexible judgment about that law, and therefore has a precedent, and therefore creates, a precedent that can be referred to by other investors and lawyers in the same type of situation. So things that may not be covered by existing legislation, because existing legislation is old and really doesn't keep up with the speed of business, can be solved under common law. Investor protection encourages the development of financial markets, and in countries with poor protection, firms suffer from the over-reliance in bank funding. Sound familiar, Nigeria? Sound familiar, Africa? However, in civil law countries that typically have poorer investor protection, laws are made by the legislature, and the judges have to stick more or less to exactly what the statutes say. So it's a lot less flexible. And the judge is expected to make judgments on that legislation, and therefore is really constrained with things that haven't yet come to a court before, for instance, unique types of investor dispute. And it allows for people to be able to wriggle out of certain situations. So the legal explanation is pretty simple. The legal explanation by LLSV says that, the reason why some countries turned out to have dispersed ownership structures with these, very deep financial markets and these sort of dynamic stock markets and IPO and all this creativity and all this technology is because they had common law. And it was civil law that held a lot of the countries that don't have these things back. So that's a legal explanation. There's another explanation given by Mark Rowe and Lucien Bebchuk, and this is a political explanation. And the political explanation argues that it's down to politics, not the law. They argue that it's actually a path dependency approach, where institutions just evolve in a path-dependent manner and are shaped by political forces. So the type of institution that will develop is very, very dependent on the type of conditions that existed before its development. So you can almost predict the outcome if you know what the pre-existing conditions are. They say that politics is key. And I've put a picture here of a Finnish sauna because it's one of the social democracies, right? And I was in one of these social democratic countries, and all of them seem to have this like sauna culture, right? Where like there's a sauna in most of the hotels, and it's a very common recreational activity. However, when I was in one of those countries, I didn't know that. So I, got into the sauna with my towel on, and like some men came into the sauna, and I thought it was segregated, but it really isn't. So that's one more thing about social democracies. But that wasn't what Ray was talking about. Ray wasn't actually talking about the sauna culture, and neither was Bebchuk. They were talking about the fact that social democracies really value equality, and they really value equal opportunities. So social democracies tend to put pressure. So like Finland, Sweden, etc., they tend to put political pressure on companies to do things that may not be in the shareholder interest. For example, they might pressure a company not to downsize during a recession because everybody has to be equal and everybody has to be happy, and education and healthcare are free, and this is sort of like a perfect heaven on earth utopia. That attitude actually makes the politicians in those countries forgo force or put pressure on companies to perhaps forgo some profit-making activities for the good of the big society. So, since only concentrated large shareholders can effectively compel managers to resist these political pressures in many of these European countries, that's what has evolved. That's the most efficient way of dealing with that political situation. So that's a Rowe and Bebchuk explanation that everything is political, and the countries that have this concentrated ownership actually have concentrated ownership because they needed to have concentrated ownership, because without it, they wouldn't be able to stand up to these politicians that are making or trying to make them make decisions that aren't in the best interest of shareholders. This is actually my favorite social democrat, Bernie Sanders. And if you missed the viral picture of him at Joe Biden's inauguration, here it is again. So while everybody was dressed in tuxes and, looking sort of very plush and posh for the inauguration, the reason why this picture went viral is because Bernie turned up in these like homemade mittens and sort of a rather old looking coat, and you can see that he really doesn't care about the glitz and glamour. And he's always advocated for more equality. He's always advocated for less capitalism or more controlled capitalism. So Rowe actually argues that it's an absence of social democracy in America that has resulted in a dispersed ownership of companies. So, maybe if America had gone the Bernie Sanders route, then you would start seeing, or had gone the Bernie Sanders route and had continually elected social democrats. And what Rowe is saying is perhaps they wouldn't have this dispersed type of stock ownership and this deep financial market that you currently see. And I spoke about this before, but I think it's worth repeating. This is Bebchuk's argument. He argues that in environments where the benefits of concentrated control are high, entrepreneurs just don't sell. The benefits of private control are sort of known as rents. And this behavior of not selling is known as rent protection. However, some people think that both the political and legal explanation are wrong, and there's four main criticisms of some of those arguments. Number one is that the analysis that LLSV did is time invariant, meaning that they haven't taken into consideration legal changes over time. Some people say that there's a problem with the logic of the argument. I mean, why isn't it the case that it's politically safer and easier for a government to pressure a few large stockholders than an anonymous herd of small investors? I'm not 100% sure of that second argument, because like I put the picture of Boris Johnson and Jeff Bezos in the background to say it would really be hard to pressure Jeff Bezos, but it might not be hard to pressure a sort of dispersed group of shareholders that don't know each other, can't really assemble or organize, and have a free rider problem. Like they don't really, they assume that somebody else is monitoring the company except them, so they're more likely to accept things. I think it would the academic argument is that, there's a problem of logic, and, it should be safer to bully Jeff Bezos than to bully a group of anonymous people, but I would go with the anonymous people. But this is one of the arguments made in the literature as to the logic of the political argument. The third one, and I've got this picture of another social democrat, AOC. She's an American politician, House of Representatives, I believe. And this year at the Met Gala, she wore a dress that said "Tax the Rich" on the back of it. And the number 3 argument is around cause and effect. And what the argument is what they argue is just because we establish a strong correlation between 2 variables doesn't mean there's a cause and effect relationship. And one of the observations around cause and effect is the fact that securities markets and this concentrated ownership were actually already present in Germany and France well before they became social democrats like AOC. So therefore, it's not necessarily true that it was the social democracy that caused the concentrated ownership, because the concentrated ownership was there before the rise of social democracy. And then number 4 is just a statistical argument, really. We say that Europe has, or the theory is that these EU countries actually have concentrated ownership because of their law and because of their politics. But actually, if you look at the numbers, European IPOs have been climbing between 1990 and 2015, while the UK and US actually declined. Plus, there's been a number of takeovers of European firms, most notably the large German telecommunications company, Mannesmann. And that was in the absence of any major legal reform. It just happened, and it's happened. It's being argued that it's happening because the world is changing in terms of its openness to trade, in terms of mass privatization, in terms of liberalization of cross-border capital flows. The fact that the European capital market, they're trying to do a stock exchange, and they're trying to do one European stock exchange, but also there's been competition between different European stock exchanges. And then, of course, this innovation and need for this minorities dispersed shareholding in these tech companies as well has just been driving that. And people that argue with these numbers just say, look, it doesn't really matter the type of politics that you have in your country. It doesn't necessarily matter what kind of legal system. It doesn't really matter what kind of sort of common law versus civil law. Look, you can't swim against the tide. Things are moving. There's liberalization. There's these tech companies. There's all of these things, and these are far stronger factors, as demonstrated by the numbers in Europe of IPOs climbing, regardless of the type of politics or the type of law that they have. And I call this the tech bro effect. And there's a picture of Jack Dorsey. I've mentioned him previously, the founder of Twitter. So we're going to deep dive into the literature now. I'm looking at 2 sorts of papers that I found really interesting. The first one is by Ruth Aguilera, and it's called Global Corporate Governance on the Relevance of Firms and Ownership Structure. So she talks about the fact that the political sociology and the political economy perspectives kind of underscore the relevance of ownership structure in a cross-national context, and it influences the type of capitalisms that these countries have developed over time. She also highlights the 2 types of agency problems. The first one we've been talking about since the first unit, which is between shareholders and managers, and that's called the principal agent type 1. And then amongst large shareholders and minority shareholders, which we've been really focusing on this unit, and that's called the principal or type 2. Now, we've been talking about like how bad concentrated blocks, these mega rich controlling families are, but she actually points out the positive elements of family firms, such as lower agency costs, because they all trust each other, and like when your brother's running the company, he's less likely to expropriate, although that happens. Long-term perspective to, they want their children and their children's children and their children's children's children to inherit the firm, so they tend to have a longer-term perspective. And they're also more likely to diversify to reduce the natural risk concentration of family wealth. So it gives me a lot to think about, because Ruth Aguilera's paper also talks about the way that sort of the political economy has influenced the type of capitalism that individual countries have actually ended up with. So it's interesting, like my private thoughts have really been stimulated around, why America is rich and why Africa is poor, and this idea of the type of politics really being a strong influence in terms of, whether a country develops these deep financial markets needed to fund innovation or not. So this is an interesting point, again, bringing back LLSV and talking about the exploration, I guess, that Ruth's paper talks about in terms of the political economy and how important it is to have these liquid markets for development, and how essential these historical factors may be, in her perspective, towards the type of type of capitalism that's developed and the level of prosperity that a country eventually has. And why don't we? Why don't we want these? I mean, she said a few good things about family firms and controlling shareholders, but I just wanted to balance that with perhaps some of the bad things that they might do. And this is from the LLSV paper. It says, when outside investors finance firms, they face a risk, and sometimes near certainty, that the returns on their investments will never materialize because controlling shareholders or managers expropriate them. The insiders use the profit of the firm to benefit themselves rather than return money to outside investors. When investor protection is good, the most investors can do is overpay themselves, put relatives in management, and undertake a few wasteful products. And sometimes in countries where investor protection is very good, and I'll be giving a few case studies later on in this module, after a point, it just becomes too stressful to expropriate, to be honest. It may just be better to pay dividends. At least they have shares and they'll get money from dividends. As diversion technology becomes less efficient, insiders actually expropriate less. And the benefits, the rents, remember I used that term, the rents of private control or the benefits of private control diminish. So in red are some of the activities where there's poor investor protection that these people, these big controlling rentier families can do. Of course, they can steal the profits, they can dilute investors, they can sell assets that the company owns below market price, they can do asset stripping, so selling company assets, they can employ family members that are incompetent, they can overpay executives, and they can do transfer pricing. And these are all disruptive for shareholder value for the minority investors. So the minority investors sort of face two main threats. Number one, they can be expropriated by the managers in a type 1 problem or a principal agent problem, and then they can be expropriated by the controlling shareholders in a type 2 problem, which is a principal problem. The minority investor is kind of sweating it out with both of these more powerful people. Deep dive 2 is the rise of dispersed ownership and the roles of the law and the state in the separation of ownership and control. And this paper is by John Coffey. It's in the Yale Law Review. It's 82 pages, but man, it's a good read. And if I was to kind of choose one of my favorite writers on this topic, it would be John Coffey. He has really sensible perspectives. He articulates his perspectives well. And I think he makes a really good point about the chicken or the egg? Obviously, I've put the chicken. So the LLSV debate on common law versus civil law, he says, may have obscured the importance of a previously hidden variable, the level of government involvement in economic decision making. So securities exchanges and dispersed ownership are actually correlated to low levels of government intervention in the private sector. And the London Stock Exchange, for instance, was privately run and has done very well. However, the Paris Bourse, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that, but I'll pronounce it Bourse. The French Stock Exchange has done quite poorly, and that's because it was a state-run monopoly, and the government interfered significantly in the stock market. So he's saying that, you know, the level of government involvement is key to whether you're going to have this dispersed ownership with the deep financial depth and lots of IPOs, or whether you're going to be like the Paris Bourse and, you know, not really have any of that. Another point that he makes is that bank-centered economies actually facilitate more government control over investment flows compared to non-bank centered economies. So when you have more investment coming from the banks, like in countries like Japan, in countries like Germany, that are very bank-centered economies as opposed to stock market or non-bank-centered economies, the government has more control. And definitely that's the case in Nigeria. I mean, it's very, very difficult to control diverse, dispersed investors all over the country with like 1 or 2%. You really can't influence credit or investment if you have to talk to 2,300 to 2,000, 3,000 people to affect the investment in a particular company. But with banks, especially Nigerian banks, I think there's only like 5 relevant banks in Nigeria. So literally you have to call up 5 people if you're particularly controlling government. And that's pretty easy. And usually all the banks haven't funded the company anyway. You can just call up one and significantly affect the company. So I think that that's why, and that's the same almost in any country in the world, that the government just has more control if it's bank-centered. And bank-centered economies facilitate more government control over investment flows compared to non-bank centered economies. So what he says, what Coffee says, is that LLSV might actually have gotten it backwards. They argue that a strong legal system creates a stronger private sector investment environment. But he says, perhaps it's a chicken or egg situation. Did the chicken come before the egg, or did the egg come before the chicken? Perhaps a strong private sector created demand for strong laws. And as we look at the history, you'll start seeing sense actually in John Coffey's argument. So let's see what you think by the end of the unit. We're going to start looking at history now. The American experience from the 1860s to the 1930s showed that really development of equity was developed largely or driven largely by the huge amounts of capital that were needed to develop railway lines. And 40% of this capital is estimated to have come from Europe via London and via Paris. Now, the big block holders were powerful. They could bribe dodgers, they could manipulate investments, and that's why they were nicknamed robber barons, because of their power to expropriate minority shareholders. So investment banker reputations, names like JP Morgan became very important because Europeans knew that if you gave your money to JP Morgan, he would actually ensure that he had board seats on the companies, which enabled his bank to monitor investments on behalf of his foreign clients. So JP Morgan famously said that he's not in the business of investment, he's not in the business of money, he's in the business of trust. And he developed this reputation for somebody that Europeans could trust with their investments in this American infrastructure. And, you know, with no mobile phones, with no email, with no WhatsApp, You can imagine how difficult it was for somebody sat in London to monitor an investment in Nigeria. To monitor an investment in Nigeria. Why do I keep on saying Nigeria? Sorry, got Nigeria on mind. To monitor an investment, somebody sat in London to monitor an investment in America. It took weeks on a ship to get to America. So the only way that they could invest these significant amounts of money was to find somebody that they trusted, and somebody that had the reputational capital required. People like JP Morgan also lobbied the New York Stock Exchange to develop self-regulated, strict rules for investment and disclosures without the government telling them to do that. And that made the New York Stock Exchange one of the most powerful stock exchanges at its inception. The Boston Stock Exchange, however, didn't institute that kind of self-regulation, even though they were competing at the time. But obviously, the Boston Stock Exchange eventually sort of fell out of favor with investors. The UK experience was similar. Before World War I, the London Stock Exchange was an open exchange, broad membership, and America wasn't as corrupt. UK wasn't as corrupt as America, so that wasn't much of an issue. But looking at both the US and the UK, neither had legal system protection early on. They had self-regulatory structures. The actual legal government frameworks actually came much later in response to crises. The French experience was very different. The Paris Bourse was always a state-controlled monopoly with a high number of state-owned and family firms, and it also concentrated more on bonds and securities rather than equity in companies. So it's really important to read history correctly. Legal protections at the time, both in the US and in the UK, were actually really difficult to enforce or non-existent, which kind of goes against the LLSV argument, which is the first one that we studied about common law versus civil law. I'm not sure that it mattered, because it was really difficult to enforce any type of legal protection back in the day. The major difference between the UK-US experience and the French experience was the presence of state intervention in corporate activity. So, Hong Kong, really interesting case, and I love their roads. So Hong Kong is a major economic center. 69 of the world's 100 largest banks have offices in Hong Kong. It's the 6th largest trading center for foreign exchange. It's the world's 7th largest recipient of foreign direct investment. Its stock market capitalization is the 7th highest in the world, and it has the 4th largest number of IPOs in the world. Now, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, despite Hong Kong's history as a British colony, meaning they had a similar legal structure to the UK, Hong Kong wasn't affected by the global financial crisis compared to the UK and other countries. And this was due to strong regulation, corporate governance, and government supervision. So the final point I'd like to make in this study is that regulation isn't the same thing as personal interest-centered government interference or poke-nosing. It's setting out a strict set of regulations to ensure that these financial centers are trusted and are transparent and disclose and are well run, and don't put qualified people, minimum qualifications for people in place, and those people are paid well, so the public sector supervisory roles and regulators actually attract the right people. So I just wanted to use this slide to sort of differentiate between government hook-nosing and selfish types of corrupt intervention, and actually good quality regulation, which can prevent financial crises. So what are the lessons? This is a picture of Jumia, which was the first African tech startup to list on the New York Stock Exchange. And I think one of the lessons is the last lesson we learned around strong regulation, the fact that free market competition goes hand in hand with capital market development. I'll be talking about legal bonding later, but the fact that legal bonding can occur when companies in emerging markets list on foreign stock exchanges, and the fact that competition either domestically or internationally between stock exchanges can induce self-regulation. And this is a really nice quote by Beck, and it makes me also think about Africa as well. Financial development can accelerate economic growth in three main ways. First, it can enhance savings. Second, it can channel these savings into real investment and thereby foster capital accumulation. Third, to the extent that financiers exercise some control over the investment decisions of entrepreneurs, financial development allows capital to flow towards more productive uses and thus improves the efficiency of resource allocation. All three channels can, in principle, have large effects on economic growth. So John Coffey actually presents two possible scenarios for developing countries. He said it could be a race to the top or a race to the bottom. The race to the top, in this scenario, countries with weak investor protection could rapidly improve on their corporate governance standards in order to compete with some of the larger foreign stock exchanges. In some cases, they might try and form regional super exchanges. Like in Africa, we could have like an AU, African Union exchange, to provide the depth and liquidity that investors and people looking for capital want. And this has actually begun to happen in some of the Latin American places because they've realized that, you know, people are choosing the New York Stock Exchange over them. The second scenario could be a race to the bottom. And in this case, countries with weak investor protection are just unable to respond rapidly enough with the corporate governance reforms needed due to entrenched interests that lobby against the regulation and want to maintain the benefits or rents, as I call them, of private control. So in this scenario, a virtuous cycle is created with these large stock exchanges like the London Stock Exchange and the New York Stock Exchange, where good reputation, transparency, and liquidity of these like few selected exchanges attract more foreign companies to cross-list on them, and these stock exchanges become super exchanges, and the only places where people end up going to list. Thank you very much, and we're on to Unit 4. We will be exploring in this unit corporate governance around the world. So we'll be looking at equity market-based systems versus bank-based systems. We'll be taking a closer look at the family-based corporate governance that you see in Asia. We'll be looking at pyramid structures and the internal capital market, and then state-owned groups, and whether they look to protect or expropriate. And I've started this unit with a picture of GT Bank. It's a Nigerian bank that are known for their fancy designs of their bank branches. So we'll start by comparing corporate governance from three different perspectives. The internal perspective, looking at reporting for managers, the incentive structures like profit share. Then we'll be looking at corporate governance from the level of board of directors. And the board of directors is really the cord that connects the internal structures with the external environment. then of course we'll be looking at corporate governance from an external perspective, so legislation, capital markets, etc. Equity-based systems in bank versus market-based economies. So in a market-based economy where stock market investment is dominant, employees have stock options, but in a bank-based system, employees are more likely to be protected by strong labor laws. Culturally, in a market-based system, there's a prevailing short-term perspective, that quarter-to-quarter perspective, whereas in a bank-based system, there's a more long-term perspective. Bank-based systems also have less likely, bank-based systems also have less appetite for risk, because they're banks, right? And less transparent reporting compared to market-based economies. And that has a link to innovation as well, because if banks have less appetite for risk, then they're not going to fund the next Google or the next Tesla, right? So bank-based economies also have less innovation. Mayer actually argues that outsider systems have a market control bias. This means that the more outside equity that is raised, the less control an original founder is likely to have. As a result, the original owner or supplier of finance is likely to have a short influence or control period. Conversely, the insider system is more likely to have a more private control bias and thus a longer influence or control period. Insiders can therefore retain control through holding voting shares or anti-takeover pacts with other investors. And if you've ever seen the show Startups on Netflix, then this is something that the startup team should have really thought about. I said we're going to look at it from the inside perspective, we're going to look at it from the board level perspective, and we're going to look at it from the external perspective. So we've looked at it from the inside perspective, we're now looking at it from the board perspective. So in a market-based system, the board plays a central role, whereas in a bank-based system, it's a lesser role due to the banks. In terms of incorporation, the banks have more of a stakeholder perspective, while market-based systems are more based on shareholder value. Sorry, that's a typo, it's shareholder value. And then in external corporate governance, market-based systems tend to have laws that protect minority shareholders, as we learned in the last unit, whereas bank systems, capital market liquidity is low, external monitoring is limited, and there's a reduced threat of takeover. Under a market-based structure, shareholders, of course, like we said throughout the last unit, are dispersed, while in a bank structure or a bank prominent structure or a bank-led structure, they are concentrated and usually related to the bank, and that's the same with the ownership structure. So in this table, we go through equity-based system or market-based system and bank-based system according to certain parameters, so I'll just zip through them. So the ownership structure, as you know, is dispersed in an equity-based system but concentrated in a bank-based system. The largest owners of industrial companies in an equity-based system are institutional investors and investment funds. In a bank-led system, it's the banks. Investors' orientation is very portfolio-orientated in an equity-based system, but control-orientated in a bank. Shareholder rights and minority protection is strong in an equity-based system, but weak in a bank-based system. Creditors' rights are strong in an equity-based system, stronger for close creditors, so more senior debt, in a bank-based system. The financial markets in an equity-based system are large. In a bank-based system, not necessarily small, but less liquid. The major agency problem in an equity-based system is shareholders versus management, or in a bank-based system, it's the banks bullying the minority investors. In terms of the board of directors, it's important and outsider guiding exists. In a bank-led system, it's limited and the insiders dominate. In terms of takeover, There's a potentially important risk that has to be considered in an equity-based system, but in a bank-based system, it's quite limited. The major monitoring mechanism is external in a market-based system, or it's internal by peer and self-monitoring in a bank-based system. The business objectives in a market-based system are shareholder value maximization, whereas in a bank-based system, it's more stakeholders. Restructuring motivation is the takeover or threat of takeover, whereas in a bank, it's more by internal pressure. In terms of equity-based systems, when there's an insolvency, it moves into bankruptcy. In a bank-led system, there'll be bank-led rescues first. In terms of business openness, the equity-based systems are, of course, more transparent than the bank-based systems. In terms of business time span, it's shorter, more profit-orientated, that quarter to quarter, Q1, what have you made type culture. But in a bank-led system, it's longer and more growth-orientated. In terms of risk is higher in an equity system than a bank-led system. In terms of company structure, banks will diversify more, whereas equity-based systems, you'll be more concentrated on the core business. So those are the major differences. This table is quite comprehensive in outlining those differences. We do have a case study later on in one of the subsequent units where we see a company from a bank-based system and a company from an equity-based system actually doing a merger, and you can imagine how that ended. So deep dive number 1 is into Dennis and McConnell's International Corporate Governance article. And what Dennis and McConnell say is that the typical large US corporation with its diffuse equity ownership structure and its professional manager appears to be only typical in the US and the UK. Ownership concentration in virtually every other country is higher than in these two countries. In many countries, majority ownership by a single shareholder is still common. And then they go on to talk about the legal structure. A country's legal system, in particular the extent to which it protects investor rights, has a fundamental effect on the structure of the markets in that country, on the government structures that are affected by companies in that country, and on the effective of the governance of those systems. So now we're going to look into some of the family-based corporate governance in Asia. So families typically control the board, and in these family-based systems, minority shareholders have weak protection. Board members are usually loyal to the family or part of the family, and that's something that we're going to, again, look at a case study in a subsequent unit. So in a family-led system, it's usually very concentrated in terms of ownership structure, whereas in a bank-led system, it's concentrated but with a lot of cross-shareholding. The largest industrial owners are families and family-controlled banks. In bank-led systems, it's just the banks. The investor orientation is control-orientated for family groups. In both systems, the protection of minority shareholders is weak. Agency problems will be the banks in the bank-led system and the family versus minority shareholders in the family-led system. The board of directors, the family control the board. In the bank system, the bank controls the board. Both of them have limited chances of takeover. In family-led companies, there's a bit of external monitoring, but also self-monitoring. In the bank, it's mostly internal. Business objectives in a family-led system are family wealth and group growth, whereas in the bank-led system, the business objectives are to please all the stakeholders. In insolvency procedures, it's a group-led rescue first, or a bank-led rescue in the bank centers. In terms of business openness, in a bank it's closed, in a family it's even more closed. But in terms of business life, sort of business time span, Both in the bank-led system and the family-led system, it seems to be longer and more growth-orientated. In terms of business risk, they're higher risk takers and they diversify some of their risk compared to the banks. So that's really the differences, the major differences between the Asian sort of family-led system and the bank-led system. Now I'm going to talk about pyramid structures, which are quite common to see in these family-led systems. So a pyramid structure is essentially a control chain with a wide base at the bottom and a narrow control point at the top. And this allows a controlling family to exercise its control from the top of the pyramid over a large range of companies with a relative, and those families have a relatively small ownership stake. The controlling family doesn't need to own all the shares in the individual company. Instead, it just owns enough to control the voting. So 3 features that you would see in a pyramid structure, LLSV strike again, and they say a pyramid has the following characteristics. Number 1, an ultimate shareholder who indirectly owns the shares of a firm. So usually there's one shareholder that say owns a firm, and then they use that firm to acquire like 20% of the next firm, and then they use that firm to acquire 20% of the next firm. So it becomes a chain of ownership. Usually there's at least one publicly traded company in the chain of intermediary firms, and then there's intercompany links, all of which are over a given threshold that allows them power and control. Burley and Means, who we met either in the first or second unit, but pretty early on, also talked about pyramids, and they said that in the modern corporation and private property, that was a paper in 1932. They said they were talking about a particular organization, the Van Sweringen organization. And they said that by this pyramid, an investment of less than $20 million has been able to control 8 Class 1 railroads, having a combined asset of $2 billion. According to Burley and Means, the Van Sweringen's business practices exemplified an important trend. And they said that among various legal devices available to ensure control of a corporation without ownership of majority shares, and I'll be speaking about a lot more about this on the next slide. This is why governance experts dislike pyramids. They dislike pyramids because the separation between control rights and cash flow rights in a pyramidal structure gives incentives for self-dealing transactions. And this is, when the controlling shareholder might transfer resources from one firm in the pyramidal chain to herself or to another high-level firm at the expense of the minority shareholders in the former firm. Examples of this, again, asset pricing, the standard tools of expropriation, asset sales, transfer pricing contracts that benefit other firms in the pyramid, simple cash appropriation, and activities like tunneling occur in wealthy families or successful families. And tunneling just means, taking some of the profits from one company to the next. Also, pyramidal control can actually disguise market power. So you might not know who owns what. Some of these pyramid structures can get really confusing. It can also frustrate tax authorities because they can't really decipher. It's more difficult to decipher who owns what, and they can also manipulate government. The Economist refers to them as control enhancing mechanisms. This is a group of mechanisms which include pyramid structures that can be used to get more power than you paid for, basically. And some people call them controlling minority structures. And the Economist refers to pyramid schemes as, one of a number of control enhancing mechanisms, including multiple voting rights, cross-holdings, shareholder voting rights, etc. But pyramid structures are the most common and most important. So we'll look at state-owned enterprises. Advantages of business groups include their ability to reduce transaction costs by filling institutional voids. In addition to this, they're good at absorbing new technology. However, they're also associated with higher levels of rent-seeking, moral hazard, and inefficient investment, as you've seen in some of the Nigerian state-owned entities like the NNPC refineries, for instance. So that's sort of on state-owned enterprises.